Okay, I want to welcome Dave Stewart. Most people have read his bio by now. A lot of us are ex-South Africans. We hope for the best for you. Other than Stan, who's there, I'm not sure the other South Africans here. But many of us left South Africa. We hope you all do well. I'm going to invite Dave to tell us what's happening. And then if you wouldn't mind asking questions on the chat feature, we'll come to them later. Okay, Dave, over to you.
Okay, well, first of all, it's a great pleasure for me to be with you guys. I have an automatic affinity with any organization with the name David in it. And secondly, I'm expecting my first grandchild in January who will be Jewish. So there we go. Now, I've been asked to speak about the history of South Africa and the past of South Africa and where we are now today, the present. But I think most of you guys probably have most of the history. If you like, I'll give you a rundown on what happened during our transformation process, because that is maybe relevant to what's happening today. If that's okay with you, then I'll begin, not with Jan van Riebeeck, but with the Second World War.
No, please, go ahead.
Okay. The reality is that South Africa came into being in its present form in 1910. The British found themselves with a rag bag of territories in Southern Africa that were vexatious and expensive. And they wanted to know, well, what do we do with these? And they thought, well, we've had a successful federation in Australia, a successful federation in Canada. Let's do the same in South Africa with our various territories there. And so, as you know, the Union of South Africa was created in 1910, and it comprised colonies of Natal, Transvaal, Free State, and Cape. And in keeping with the custom of the time, full sovereign power was not given to the majority, but to the white population. For the next 40 years, South Africa progressed very much along the lines of the other Commonwealth countries. They went to Commonwealth conferences and fought on the side of the Brits in the Second World War, but there was a major difference. In the other Commonwealth countries, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the indigenous populations were a small minority. In South Africa, they were a large majority, 75% of the population at the time of union. But this was the era of colonialism, and it wasn't a big deal. In a continent where everybody was ruled by European powers, white domination in South Africa didn't seem to be out of step. In a world in which racial discrimination was shockingly the norm, South Africa's racial discrimination also didn't seem to be out of place. But the world was changing. And I think that perhaps the seminal point came in 1948 with the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it proclaimed, really, and it was revolutionary at that time, that all people are equal, and that discrimination on any lines, race, culture, language, was wrong, and that people had a right to self-determination. And so South Africa increasingly found itself out of step with this new world norm. And it became more and more apparent with the decolonization process. 1957, the first African colony to gain independence was Ghana. But then there was a rush. And by the middle 70s, virtually all of the countries of Africa were independent. And in February 1960, Harold Macmillan visited South Africa, and he made a speech in the South African Parliament. And he said, the winds of change are blowing through Africa. There is a new nationalistic sentiment among African peoples that you cannot ignore, and you cannot ignore it in your own planning. And you must have appreciation for this, because you, white South Africans, were the first nationalists in Africa. So he accepted the idea of a white South African nation, strangely enough. And the next 30 years were a struggle between what he had referred to as a free white nation and this emerging Black African nationalism. And it was going to go in one direction. South Africa became the international bogeyman because it was the antithesis of this newly evolving sense of values, which was entirely good. That is non-discrimination, non-racialism, self-determination. And by the mid-80s, we found ourselves isolated. We were with our backs to the wall. We were riding a tiger of Black nationalism in South Africa. The world was shouting at us to get off. No, get off the tiger, have one man, one vote elections. And we wanted to do this, but the problem was that getting off a tiger is a dangerous business. And we had existential fears. The first one was that, especially for Afrikaners, they regarded themselves as a nation. And they thought, well, how on earth are we going to be able to retain our right to nationhood in a one-man, one-vote dispensation where we're a small minority? And what guarantee will there be for the future of minorities in such a state? And these were reasonable concerns. Most people in the world have a fervent belief in their right to rule themselves, but that was up for grabs. The second concern was what had happened in Africa. The fact is that the African decolonization process had not led to successful democratic states. In fact, there had been general chaos, mayhem, and economic retrogression. By the mid-80s, there had been more than 80 coups d'etats in Africa, and there were only 2 or 3 genuine democracies in the whole continent. So how were we to know it wasn't going to be one man, one vote, one time? And our third concern was the influence of the South African Communist Party in the ANC. And this was not Reds under beds. The reality is that during the 80s, the 70s, and the 80s, a significant majority of the members of the ANC's National Executive Committee in exile were also members of the South African Communist Party. They subscribed to the classic Soviet 2-phase revolutionary process. The first phase is the national liberation under the National Liberation Movement, which was the ANC. And the second phase is when the Communist Party takes over as the vanguard party and leads to the unalloyed blessings of socialism. And again, this wasn't just a theory. The fact was that the Soviet Union was projecting itself in Southern Africa in a big way. It was spending billions of rubles, supporting up to 50,000 Cuban troops in Angola. And this was our primary geostrategic concern. So, we wanted to get off the back of the angry tiger, but these were realities. And so we looked at different ways of doing this. What tried territorial partition, but it was a catastrophe. It brought greater injustice. The reality is there's no place in Southern Africa where whites are even close to being in a majority. And then, 1978, P.W. Botha took over. He said, we must adapt or die. And he was a reformer. And he said, well, we'll reform apartheid. And as you know, he legalized trade unions in a so everybody had trade union rights. He tried to bring the colored and Indian minorities into the same polity as the whites, with very, very mixed success. By 1986, he had repealed more than 100 apartheid laws and regulations and measures, including some of the most obnoxious, like the Mixed Marriages Act, and like the Sex Across Race Lines Act, and of course the hated pass law, which went in 1986. But PW was evidently not a student of Alexis de Tocqueville. He didn't understand that revolutions do not take place in situations of repression. They take place exactly in periods of reform. And his reforms, and particularly the reforms bringing coloreds and Indians into the polity, same polity as whites, just gasoline on the already incendiary expectations of the UDF and Black South Africans and colored South Africans. Their battle cry wasn't reform. It's not, we want to sit on the same park benches as you guys. It was Amandla, power. And that's what it was all about. And we then, I think in the mid-1980s, entered a period of absolute gloom and despondency. And if any of you guys left South Africa at that time, I would understand, because there didn't seem to be any hope. The world was united against us. Sanctions were increasing. We had unrest throughout the country. The Rand was going to hell after P.W. Botha's Rubicon speech. There didn't seem to be any hope. But then things started to change, as they do in history. Suddenly, a lot of the robots turned green. Firstly, by 1987, after the re-establishment of law and order following the state of emergency, the ANC reached the conclusion that there was not going to be a revolutionary victory. The government had already reached the conclusion that there wasn't going to be a solution by armed force. And it is only when parties understand that there cannot be an armed solution by force that you get genuine negotiations. And one of the first people to recognize this was Nelson Mandela, when he opened a line of communication with the P.W. Botha government in 1986-87. So that was the first green light. The second green light came in October 1987 with the Battle of the Lomba River in southern Angola, which was maybe one of the biggest set-piece battles in Africa since the Second World War. The Cubans and the Russians had persuaded the Angolans to try and capture Savimbi's headquarters in Jamba. This meant they had to cross the Lomba River. And they deployed up to between 50 and 70,000 troops to achieve this. And the SADF and UNITA stopped them at the Lomba River. We destroyed in that battle and subsequent battles over 120 Soviet-built tanks, destroyed a complete Angolan brigade of 5,000 men. And this was a turning point in the history of Southern Africa because it persuaded Gorbachev to pull the plug on Soviet involvement in Southern Africa. He then told the Cubans and the Angolans that they had to reach a peace agreement with South Africa, which they did the next year in 1988. And in terms of that agreement, Cuban forces were withdrawn from Angola, and the UN independence plan in Namibia was implemented. And Namibia became independent in a proper process with a proper constitution. It was in many respects a dry run for South Africa. So that was another green traffic light, green robot that went in the right direction. Then in January 1989, P.W. Botha had a serious stroke. And he then took the inexplicable decision to resign as the head of the National Party. And at a caucus meeting on the 2nd of February 1989, FW, who was the conservative candidate, FW De Klerk, was elected as the leader of the National Party. And that was essential because I don't think P.W. Botha would have been able to do the things that had to be done in order to reach a negotiated settlement. FW became president in September 1989. He immediately started to liberate the system. He allowed protests and demonstrations in the streets, started to restore normality. He released most of the Robben Island prisoners in December, and he then spoke with Mandela and built up a relationship with them. Then, of course, on the 9th of November, the other big development took place, and that was the fall of the Berlin Wall. That created a completely new geostrategic situation. And F.W. de Klerk's great contribution to the process was to realize that the circumstances would never again be so propitious, so favorable for negotiations as they were at the beginning of the 1990s. The SACP was in disarray, the ANC was in disarray, its armed struggle was going nowhere. The world was changing, the paradigm was now the Washington Consensus, it was free-market democracy. And de Klerk realized that the circumstances would never again be so propitious for negotiations. So on the 2nd of February, he removed every possible obstacle to negotiations that anyone could think of. He unbanned the ANC, he unbanned the SACP. He opened the door to constitutional negotiations, and he announced, of course, the release of Nelson Mandela. And after that, we started a roller coaster of negotiations. Next 4 years were traumatic. We were plagued by faceless violence from extremists on all sides who didn't want a solution. But nevertheless, the Codesa talks began in December 1991, and we made great progress in the first half of 1992. Then the ANC pulled the plug because the left wing in the ANC, led by the SACP, decided that too many concessions had been made, and they should try the Leipzig option. They felt that if they could get enough people in the streets, if they had rolling mass action, if they had national strikes, they could achieve what the East Germans achieved a year or two earlier in East Germany and bring about the fall of the government. But it didn't work. But it did bring South Africa closer and closer to the precipice. And that precipice was almost reached at the Bishu massacre in early September 1992. And I think it was Mandela who then reasserted control in the alliance and gave instructions to resume the negotiations, which happened on the 26th of September 1992. But of course, as soon as the ANC came back on board, the IFP and all of the right-wing parties left. But nevertheless, we then progressed in 1993 with really substantive negotiations on a new constitution. We had the huge crisis of Chris Haney's assassination on the 10th of April, 1993, but we resolved that to a large extent because of the statesman-like behavior of Nelson Mandela. And then in 1993, in December, we reached agreement on our interim constitution, which contained 34 immutable principles which had to be included in the final constitution. And on that basis, we held our first elections, first universal democratic elections, and on the 24th of April, 27th of April, 1994. And the ANC, of course, won, as we all knew it would, with 62%. The National Party got 20.4%. And then we started with the government of national unity. Nelson Mandela didn't chair cabinet meetings. He was above the political fray, and he dedicated himself in a wonderful way to promoting reconciliation and national unity. Thabo Mbeki ran the government. In 1999, Mandela retired, and Thabo Mbeki took over as president. But in 1996, the ANC took a really important decision, and that was to dump the socialist RDP program and to adopt much more orthodox macroeconomic policies of the gear approach. And the result of that was that under Trevor Manuel's leadership, South Africa achieved economic growth of over 5% in 2005, 2006, and 2007. We had a budget surplus. Manuel reduced our national debt from 46% of GDP to only 23% of GDP. But all of this was, of course, anathema to the SACP and COSATU, the ANC's alliance partners, Communist Party and the main Federation of Trade Unions, COSATU. And at COSATU's Congress in December 2006, they took a decision to re-win the heart and soul of the ANC and to put South Africa back on the path to the national democracy and to socialism. And to Mbeki's immense surprise, at Polokwane in Northern Transvaal, the old Northern Transvaal, New Limpopo, they beat Mbeki. And their candidate was, of course, the charismatic Zulu populist Jacob Zuma. Another thing that they did at Polokwane was to take a decision to disband the Scorpions, the very successful anti-corruption unit within the National Prosecuting Authority. Thabo Mbeki didn't last long after that. He was recalled. Jacob Zuma became president in 2009 after a short interim presidency of Kagiso Motlanthe. And then we had the Zuma years. And to start with, the SACP thought they were doing really well. They had 15 ministries which they controlled, most of the ministries dealing with property and with economic affairs. And they were bragging about how they were moving South Africa in the direction of socialism, noticing that while they were trying to capture the state for socialism, Jacob Zuma was capturing it for himself and his friends. And Zuma managed to get hold of the National Prosecuting Authority, and he managed to get hold of the police, so he could decide who would be prosecuted and who wouldn't be prosecuted. He got hold of the intelligence services, so they had full dossiers on all of his colleagues in the National Executive Committee. The result was... Hello? The result was that the floodgates of corruption were opened, and South Africa lost tens of billions, not of rands, but dollars in the process. The electricity generating organization, Eskom, has now become a basket case with a debt of over 450 billion rand, and it isn't generating electricity. So we were, again, looking at the precipice, but fortunately the institutions in our constitution, our new constitution, came through. Our wonderful public protector, Thuli Madonsela, led the process of exposing Zuma's corruption. She was supported by many of the stalwarts in the ANC process. they were aided by excellent investigative journalists and by activist non-governmental organizations. And the result was that Zuma was recalled. And then at the 2017 five-yearly conference of the ANC at Nasrec, Cyril Ramaphosa won a marginal victory over Zuma's candidate, his former wife, Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. Everybody breathed a great sigh of relief. Cyril Ramaphosa's instincts were good. He wanted to implement the ANC's National Democratic Plan, which, although it has faults, was at least a rational way of addressing our problems. He wanted to stop corruption. He wanted to reestablish the integrity of key state institutions like the National Prosecuting Authority and the police, and to reestablish the proper management system in the parastatals like ESCOM. And he's made progress on this. But now, in 2020, there is a great deal of doubt about the degree to which he is actually in control of the process. There is extreme concern that the Zumaites, or the Ace Magashules, the David Mabuzos, and others who have an absolute interest in the continuation of corruption may be calling the shots. The coming months are going to be very important as a test of the real position of Cyril Ramaphosa. Will there be prosecutions of powerful, corrupt people? Will he be able to reassert his authority within the ANC alliance? Will he be able to steer South Africa back toward the pragmatic economic policies that were followed by Trevor Manuel and Thabo Mbeki in 2007, the period up to 2007. So that's more or less where we are now. We are faced with enormous problems, which have, of course, been complicated by COVID, as they have been for countries throughout the world. But we have unemployment. We had unemployment before COVID of almost 40%. We have unacceptable inequality in the country. We have the world's highest Gini coefficient of 0.65. We have really bad education services. We're not getting value for the enormous amount of money we spend on education. The economy has been growing at a very, very slow pace, and we really need economic growth of 5%, the kind of growth we had in 2005 and 2007 to address the problems that confront the country. So that is basically the situation now. We have a lot of positives, though, that I'd like to mention. First of all, we are still a constitutional democracy. We're a functioning constitutional democracy after 26 years, and this is a real achievement. Secondly, we're still sitting on the greatest reserves of minerals in the world. Thirdly, we have a sophisticated economy. We have really advanced financial services, and our automobile industry now contributes as much or more to the GDP as mining does. We have 900,000 kids at university. So we're the gateway to Africa, which is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. So there are these really positive things about the current situation as well. So for us in South Africa, as you guys know, nothing is ever certain. Future is uncertain. We think that the determining factor will be our ability to abide by our excellent Constitution and to realize the foundational values in that Constitution, in Section 1 of the Constitution, which are human dignity, the achievement of equality, the advancement of human rights and freedoms, non-racialism, non-sexism, the supremacy of the Constitution and the rule of law, and a genuine democratic system which is open, responsive, and accountable. So that's what our foundation is doing. We're trying to support that Constitution. And in the meantime, life in Cape Town is pretty good.
Thanks, Dave. That's interesting. Let me just take your spotlight now. We'll welcome questions from anybody. First question I have is actually from me. Why hasn't Zuma and his friends been prosecuted yet?
Well, this is the $64,000 question. And Zuma, the net is tightening around Zuma. So I think that there are very few legal defenses that remain before he is actually prosecuted. So we're moving in the right direction, but it will be a very, very big test to see whether he actually lands in court and has to account for his crimes.
Good. Next question comes from David Joss in Atlanta. Why is Eskom such a disaster? How can a country grow its economy without reliable electricity?
Well, it's a very good question. And you know, the tragedy is that Eskom used to be a world leader. I think 30 years ago, Eskom was one of the top 7 utilities in the world. But again, it is because of completely inappropriate policies. Instead of appointing people on the basis of merit, they were appointed on the basis of their membership of the ANC and on the basis of race. And when Eskom was going through a huge crisis a couple of years ago, they still wanted to get rid of the 1,000 remaining white engineers, because the important thing was not whether you were producing anything, but whether you were demographically representative, whether you had your racial quotas right. So I think that one of the important things will be to restore the integrity of Eskom's management, and I think this is happening. I think they've got a good management team in place now, but they've got an awfully deep hole to dig out of, and that's 450 billion rand debt.
Okay, I'm going to come to Jason's question last, because I think that's the most important, but I'll come to Mike Morris's question. What has happened to the military?
Yeah, it's sad. You know, the fact I told you about the Battle of Lomba River, the fact is we used to have a really, really good, you know, defense force, whether one supported whatever cause they were supposed to be defending. But professionally, they were pretty good. And that is no longer the case. Our defense forces fall into bits, but then unfortunately, many of the things in the public domain have fallen to bits. The private sector is still functioning pretty well. We still have great companies. You can still go into Woolies, Woolworths, and a lot of shops which are world class. Our financial services are world class. So you have this strange situation in South Africa of a pretty well functioning private sector, but a state sector which is struggling.
Okay, next question from David Joss again. David, you'll have to pay double now. Is there any hope of bringing down the horrific violent crime rate?
Yeah, again, this is one of the spin-offs, I think, of the high unemployment we have, and the fact that you have a lot of kids with nothing to do, you know, with no hope, no future. Well, on the side of crime, the reality is that 80% of people who are murdered in South Africa are murdered by people they know. So you must just get very careful who you know in South Africa. But a lot of it is interpersonal. It's family murders, violence. People have too much to drink over the weekend and they pull out knives and guns. So during the COVID lockdown, when we had restrictions on alcohol, the murder rate went down, quite steeply. So let's hope that there are ways that we can address this, but we're going to solve a lot of these problems only when we can do the basic things right, and that is to get the economy going, to achieve growth rates of 5% plus, to get the education system working properly so we have more and more young Black people who can move into good jobs throughout the economy. Those are the basics. We've got to get away from the ideological stuff that doesn't work to the pragmatic stuff that does work.
Okay, next question. Is there any effort to reverse the brain drain?
Yeah, the fact is that a lot of South Africans, young South Africans, feel that they don't have a future in the country because of, again, these demographic quotas which are beginning to pop up all over the place. What the ANC did was to say to white people, you can't work really in the public sector any longer, and now increasingly there's no future for you in the big companies. So you people have got to either become professionals or you've got to start your own businesses and become entrepreneurs. And ironically, as a result of that, whites have benefited from the new South Africa more than anybody else. It has not been detrimental to most white South Africans. You have a lot of white South Africans who've actually returned and who come back to Cape Town and Johannesburg and Durban just because of the lifestyle. It is still really, really pleasant to live in Cape Town. You get much more house, you get much better education for your money than you do in most places in the world. But this is a challenge. It's a real challenge. We have to get the message across that there's a future for all people in this country, irrespective of their race.
Thank you. I'm going to put your question last with Jason's. So I'm going to come to Leonard Lace's question. Will the voting public ever vote for a government that will do good and not just vote for the ANC?
In most countries, people don't vote according to the policies of the parties involved. They vote according to their emotions. This also happens, I believe, in the United States and the UK. It happened in white politics in South Africa. In the past, you voted either for the National Party or you voted for the UP. It was a blood thing. It wasn't a question of, oh, their policies are better than their policies. I think the point is coming when a lot of Black South Africa are going to say, look, this isn't working for us. We need a government that is going to deliver. And the good news there is that the DA government in the Western Cape really is delivering. And the more the DA can get that message across, I think the better it's going to do in elections. But it's not going to happen quickly because these things don't change all that rapidly.
Right. Something that concerns all of us about reading about South Africa in the newspaper is what's happening to, what can you say about Malema, who's very radical?
Yeah, Malema is, if they say if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, if it looks like a duck, the chances are it's a duck. And if you walk like a fascist, you talk like a fascist, you mobilize on racial lines, you call yourself commander-in-chief, your people wear funny uniforms, the chances are you're a fascist. And that is the problem with Malema. He's very clever. He knows how to grab the headlines. But I don't think that he has the potential to win more than about 8 or 9% of the vote. If he wants a future, he'll have to get back into the ANC alliance. And I think he knows that. So one has to watch very carefully what happens in the relationship between the EFF and the ANC.
Good. I have here a question from somebody who came here in March for 9 days, got stuck because of COVID, and is still in the USA, back to South Africa. He's interested in how much foreign investment is leaving the country and how do you attract more investment back to South Africa or into South Africa?
Again, it's not rocket science. You are not going to attract investment if you do not unambiguously support property rights. And the more the ANC talks about expropriation without compensation, the more it talks about its ideological program of the National Democratic Revolution, the more it's going to scare off investors. People are not going to invest in a country where the government comes along and tells them whom they can appoint at senior levels in the local company that they've just bought. So one just has to return to pragmatic policies that we know work throughout the world where they're tried. And some people think that we might hit this point if South Africa has to go to the IMF for a bailout, because we're now really living on the precipice of what we can afford. And if the IMF comes in, then we might have to adopt pragmatic policies, which will be a good thing, because the potential here remains enormous. It's we've got the mineral basis, we've got all of these other things going for us. We've got tremendous tourist potential. So it's just a question of having the right pragmatic policies, the kind of policies that Thabo Mbeki and Trevor Manuel had in the first decade of the 2000s. So it can be done.
I have a question here from Lawrence. He saw a documentary about extreme poverty camps with many whites as residents. Is one to assume that the issues can now cross the racial divide?
Yeah, look, there's been a big change in the economic racial mix in South Africa. Whites are still undoubtedly the most advantaged section, but they no longer make up anything like a majority in the middle class. They're about 30% going down to 25% of the middle class. There is a strong emerging black middle class. There are now 4 million black, colored, and Indian South Africans with higher educational qualifications than half of the white population. There are 1.7 million black, colored, and Indian households that earn more than a third of white households. So it's no longer a question that if you're white, you're rich on benefit and advantaged. You have a new emerging elite among the black population. And you have as much inequality now within the black population as you have within the country as a whole. And that, I think, is going to be a problem for the ANC in future. That this huge gulf is now developing between the advantaged middle class and people who've got political connections and the great majority of people sitting at the bottom of the pile, many of whom are now subsisting on state handouts. So 17 million South Africans, almost a third of the population, subsist on state handouts.
Dave, I have a question here, but for the non-South Africans or ex-South Africans, the question is, do you have a private security firm protecting you and your family? If you could expand on that, I'd appreciate it. That is done otherwise.
I've got two. I have ADT and I have Verifier. So I've got cameras, I've got electric fences, I've got my cameras are being monitored 24 hours a day by a verifier. I've got armed response. And this is what we do in South Africa. It's a pain in the neck. I think it's probably very similar to what happens in many Latin American countries as well, where you have big gaps in income equality. Yeah, it's all there. But I've been mugged. My wife and I have been mugged. We've got the T-shirt.
I'll just tell you a quick story before I go to the last three questions.
Yeah.
Is in the late 90s, 98, 99, a young black guy came from America to start ADT in South Africa. He attended, I think it was Brothers College in Sandton.
Mm-hmm.
He lived in Soweto. He was the first black head boy, and this was still in that time, which was quite an achievement. Tyco, which owned ADT, brought him to America, trained him, gave him an MBA. He was the 6th highest employee of Tyco. They sent him back to South Africa to start ADT. Great guy.
Fantastic.
Anyhow.
Well, that's a story we need. You know, we need success stories like that.
I'll tell you the other half, though. I'd like to talk about something very quickly, but very important to all of us. This refers to the cemetery incident in Oudtshoorn, indicative of anti-Semitism. But for us, we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism in South Africa. Are you able to talk about that at all?
Well, as I mentioned, my son is married to a Jewish girl, so we're very close to the community. And we take these things very personally. There is a strong Muslim community, particularly in Cape Town, many of whom are quite radical, who have been mobilizing against Israel. The government has been moving more and more in their direction. But recently, the Chief Justice, Mogoeng, made a very positive statement about Israel. So it's not all one directional. It is a growing problem. I don't think that there is a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment at grassroots level. I think it's more confined to radical political groups. So it's something that we have to watch very carefully.
Okay, quick answer, because we're running out of time before the last two. I had one talking about the killing of the white farmers, which is a bit horrifying.
Yeah, look, this is horrifying. The government tends to play this down because you're talking about maybe 70 murders, 60, 70 murders a year in a country which experiences 19,000 murders a year. So you would understand that we have lost more people in civil murders since 1994 than the United States lost in the Second World War. But that's not really the point. The point is that the rate is much higher. The murder rate in the country as a whole is about 37 per 100,000, which is very high. Not the highest in the world, but it's getting there. The United States is about 6 or 8 per 100,000. World average is about 6. In Japan, it's 0.1. So it's a problem, and it's a problem because this is a special category of people, because there are politicians out there saying, kill the farmer. You can't ignore this kind of crime. And more farmers have been killed in South Africa than the people who have been killed in shooting incidents in the United States in the same period. So one should bear all of those factors in mind. And it is a serious problem, and there is an aggressive racial element to it in many cases.
Thank you. I'm going to join two questions from Jason and Stan together. And the second part is probably what you've been waiting for. Jason asks, what do you think is the most likely path forward for South Africa? And then Stan says, does the FW De Klerk Foundation have any influence on Ramaphosa? and I suppose the process?
Well, as far as the first question is concerned, I think the whole thing depends to a very large extent on our ability to stick by our constitution. If we can do that, I'm reasonably confident about the future, whatever happens to Cyril. So that is an important factor. As far as the role of the FW De Klerk Foundation is concerned, we have seen that non-governmental organizations have played a very significant role in defending the Constitution and keeping South Africa on the right track, like Free Market Foundation, the Institute of Race Relations, the Ellen Suzman Foundation, have used the courts with great effect to promote constitutional democratic governance. We have all been out there struggling against things that are unconstitutional, that can make things fall apart. So yeah, non-governmental organizations like the FW De Klerk Foundation can make a difference.
Well, thanks, Dave. We're just under an hour. That was fascinating. I learned a lot that I didn't know. I'm sure everybody did. I would love to have you back sometime to continue this conversation.
Well, anytime. It's great. It's a great pleasure for me.
We'll give you the last word.
Well, yeah, look, somebody once said that the worst never happens in South Africa, neither does the best. I think it was Jan Smuts. South Africa has always been problematic. I think everybody who's ever visited the country since 1652 has said, look, it's a hell of a nice place, but it's not going to last for more than 5 years. And here we are, we're still there. Life is still extremely agreeable in Cape Town. There's no place I'd rather live in the world than Cape Town. And I have lived in the United States, in Britain, and in Australia, East Africa. So it is a country with enormous potential, but it is blocked by incompetent politicians who are more concerned with ideology than they are in the interests of their own supporters. I've got to work on that.
But thank you, that was really good. Thanks everybody for attending on Sunday morning, Sunday evening. We appreciate it and we hope to talk again soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody.
Cheers.